All right, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. This is Sandra Masters, your host and producer, and I'm here with Jill Joyner, our presenter for today, and she's presenting a session on diversity. It ain't what it used to be. So, Jill, welcome back to site, and thank you so much for presenting this important information for our members.
Yes, thank you so much, Sandy, for that gracious introduction. I'm really excited to do this. This is my first webinar for Site, and I am so happy to see everybody that has decided to join today. Like we mentioned earlier, I know that this is a busy time of year for people, finishing vacations, starting back to school, all that. So I'm glad that we are able to have the recording for you to share with your coworkers, but also for those people that are unable to attend today.
And
And
just adjust your mic just a tiny little bit down so that
oh,
we get
okay,
not the feedback. So great, thanks.
okay. Is that better?
Yes, absolutely. Thank
Oh,
you.
okay,
Awesome.
great, great. I see some familiar names in our attendees. Cindy, great to see you again, and hope to see all of you all in Memphis. A special shout out to our member from Boston. That is my hometown. So, although I've lived in Texas quite a while, Boston is where I was born and raised a lot of my life. So,
That's
special
great.
shout out. Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started since we do have a lot to cover. Today's session, from compliance to science, diversity, it ain't what it used to be. Now, this is a session that I presented at the site conference just a couple of months ago in June and was asked to do a repeat for the members that weren't at the conference or weren't able to attend that session. So I hope that you find this information useful. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to start off by saying we all know that diversity is on the forefront of today's headlines. From NFL players taking a knee to the Me Too movement to police shootings, the list goes on and on. Today's headlines have put diversity and inclusion into the forefront, and it has fueled the fires of contention and divisiveness. So no matter what side of the fence you're on, diversity and inclusion, and I'm just going to abbreviate it by saying D&I, is a fact of life as our country becomes more multicultural and more tolerant of differences. So in response to this, more and more organizations are ramping up their D&I initiatives so that they can stay relevant with today's changing society, which includes demographics, changing beliefs, changing values. But how did teaching about diversity make its way into the workforce? And what can we do, and what can our organizations do to create an environment to get the best performance out of our co-workers and our employees? Sorry about that. I don't know if you guys heard that little ping, but that was me touching the wrong button. Okay, I'm going to take a second to pause and let you all read this quote. This is a quote, is probably my favorite quote by Maya Angelou. And the reason that I chose this quote for this session is because it is so appropriate. Several years ago, I went to a high school reunion. And of course, it had been, gosh, I'm not going to tell you how many years, but it had been several decades since I had seen many of my high school classmates. And I couldn't remember everybody's name. I couldn't remember everybody's face, but those people who I knew, I remembered how they made me feel. So if you think about seeing somebody that you don't remember their name, or which class you may have had with them, all I remembered was how they made me feel. And this is something that people will always take with them. And so this is why I'd like to share this for my session. It's my favorite quote. And it's a key point to remember as we go through this session today. So what are we going to cover today? Well, what I hope we'll learn is the evolution of diversity inclusion. How did it go from compliance to science? And what exactly does that mean? Well, we'll cover that today. What is some of the key concepts of diversity and inclusion? What is it that I need to know to be current and relevant in my diversity terminology, in strategies, and just ways that I can make people feel more inclusive? So we'll cover those three topics. This quote right here I really liked when I was trying to find something to include in this session. And this graphic, what it means to me is that 1 plus 1 equals 3. That was something that I had picked up at a leadership seminar that I attended, is that 1 plus 1 equals 3, meaning you're going to get a different outcome than if one person were to try to do something themselves, a task themselves. And the result can be multiplied by having different perspectives and different points of views. So the more differences that you have, the more of a likely chance that you're going to have a different outcome as if everybody's input was the same. So speaking of terminology, hopefully you've had a chance now to download the handout that is titled Diversity Compliance to Science Handout. And on that handout, you'll see a list of terms. So this is some current terminology that you'll hear when you hear people speaking about diversity and inclusion. Terminology changes over time, just like labels and things that we call people change. Well, so does terminology. So as we go through this session, if you have any questions about what a particular term means, you can just take a look at this sheet and this will help you. Okay, we're going to start off with the poll. So Sandy, do you want to start the first poll question?
All right, here it is. So easy question. Does your organization have diversity or inclusion in your mission statement? Yes or no? And we'll do these pretty quickly. Try to get to 90% voting, so bring everyone back. We like lots of participation. All right. Okay, where is everyone? Come back to me. Anyone else want to weigh in? All right. Okay, last chance. Here we go. Looks like 33% yes and 67% no. Does that surprise you?
Oh. Well, it does and it doesn't. It surprises me as in we would hope that more organizations would have either the words diversity or inclusion or the spirit of diversity and inclusion in their mission statement. So some of you all may have the spirit in your mission statement, but not the exact words. However, I do believe you'll probably start to see that change as organizations are starting to become on board with trying to create that inclusive environment. And people will not know if you have an inclusive environment unless you tell them. Okay, so for instance, I know for me, when I'm looking for, well, when I was looking for a job, when I was looking for a new organization, I would go and I would look and see who the leadership is, who represents the leadership, because typically they'll have pictures. And I'll also look and see if they have diversity and inclusion in their mission statement. And you can tell they may have it in the mission statement, but it may not be reflected in their leadership. And so to me, that's a flag. That's just a flag. That's something personal that I look for. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit because I've got some statistics I want to share about one particular organization and the surprises that came out of them doing an analysis of who they had in their organization. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. How did we get here? How did the workplace become involved in teaching people how to treat others? Shouldn't we have learned this at home or at church or at school? Why are they teaching us this at work? How did diversity and initiative evolve into its current state? Well, let's take a look at the history. Back in the 1940s, President Roosevelt issued executive orders concerning equal employment. At first, it was focused on preventing employment discrimination for government defense contracts. But then they decided that they wanted to desegregate the armed forces because we needed more men at that time, and some women too, in the armed forces. And so because of that need, there was a desegregation of the armed forces. They decided to not just have it be just for white men or for the few women that were in the service at that time, but to try to reach out for other people. However, it did not go into effect until the Truman administration. So that's why you'll see on this newspaper that President Truman wipes it out, but it was actually Roosevelt that started it. So that led to Rosie the Riveter. Yes, we can do it. In the 1940s, because of World War II, there was a shortage of workers in factories and shipyards because all the men were at war. So this created a need to mobilize populations that had previously been denied access to some jobs and some opportunities. Enter minorities and women. Okay. So we see here that one of the motivators for encouraging diversity in business was increasing production capacity and performance, because we had all these products that we needed to churn out, and we had nobody to work in the factories because all the men were gone to war. So that opened the door for more opportunities for men and women. Then in the 1960s, the civil rights movement turned the focus of discrimination by addressing racial segregation and discrimination not only at work, but at school, at church, and in all places. The Civil Rights Act was enacted, and it became illegal for businesses to practice discriminatory hiring or firing based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And so a lot of people will always ask me, well, what does it mean, color? If we have race there, then why do we have color? Color is discrimination based on I guess you could say the pigment or so of a person's skin color. So in other words, you might have a light-skinned African American that might get a job over a dark-skinned African American, you know, or any other of the races that have, which we all do, have a multitude of pigments within our nationalities. So it became illegal to discriminate against color also. But the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Office, created this. Oh, I am so sorry. I thought I turned my ShoreTel off and I got a call. So sorry about that. The Equal Opportunity Office, they wanted to address workforce discrimination, so they decided to add age, disability, sex, gender identity, genetic information to the mix. And so I've also been asked, well, what is genetic information? Genetic information, pretty much the reason this one was added to the mix was because there was a lot of discrimination against blacks because of sickle cell anemia. A lot of blacks, back then in the 60s, they were starting to do more research and showed that a lot of blacks were more predominantly the group that was contracting sickle cell anemia. And so companies were discriminating against. I am so sorry. I want to turn off my ShoreTel, but I don't know if that's going to disconnect me from the webinar. ShoreTel is our phone system. So let me see.
We can just ignore
I don't
it.
think it'll.
It's not very loud.
Okay.
Just ignore it. Pretend
Okay.
like it's not ringing.
Okay.
It's not that loud.
I'm so sorry.
No worries.
And yeah, and
no need to apologize.
Okay. All right. So anyway, so back to the webinar. So because of the Civil Rights Act and because of the new office of the EEOC, you started to see more firms correcting previous abuses because of a moral obligation, right? So it wasn't necessarily driven by legislature like in the, oh my gosh, in the 40s, but it was more so because people knew it was the right thing to do, right? And the motivation was to promote equality through legal means at the cost for those who did not comply. So in other words, people were being charged, companies were being fined for not complying to these new regulations. Then in the 70s, there was a focus on addressing discrimination for past abuses, which led to the creation of affirmative action programs. And one of the things I want to point out is that affirmative action programs have gotten a bad rap, and it's only because people just do not fully understand the purpose of affirmative action programs. A lot of people thought it was reverse discrimination. all affirmative action programs were trying to do was to provide opportunities for qualified individuals who have been historically or currently deprived of job opportunities, and to prevent those recurrences from happening in the future. So what that means pretty much is that affirmative action was just trying to right the wrongs of the past and make sure that it didn't happen in the future. And what an affirmative action program does is it helps companies identify how the percentage of their organization should be made up of qualified people from the community. So, in other words, if you have if you're in a community and you have 20% of the qualified people for particular positions are of one ethnic group, then your organization should be made up of 20% of people from that ethnic group. And so that's what affirmative action does. Companies run utilization analysis to see if they are actually utilizing everybody in their community in their candidate pool effectively, and if they're giving them a fair shake by mirroring it to the representation of the community. So, but because of the fact that it has had a bad reputation, some organizations feel that affirmative action programs are shoved down their throats, or that they're penalized. And it's not necessarily a penalty because of trying to punish a company, but it's more so to help them see that you have a pool of candidates that can help provide diversity to your organization. Okay, so employers generally implement formal affirmative action programs now as a condition of doing business with the government, because the government has strict guidelines on affirmative action and making sure that organizations that do business with them have programs. So these programs can be required by a court as a past remedy. So if you have an organization that has a history of discriminatory practices, the government may say, hey, you guys need an affirmative action program. However, a lot of organizations do it voluntarily because they just feel that it's the right thing to do, that it's a moral obligation for them. So in 1987, there's a group called the Hudson Institute that created this Workforce 2000 report that projected that the U.S. economy was going to transition from a manufacturing industry to service industries. And we can see that has come true. You think about the Rust Belt with all the factories closing, with all our jobs going overseas, all the manufacturing jobs. Now, where in the United States, it's more a service industry. Think about the proliferation of online services that have happened even in the past 10 years. So we have moved as a country from a manufacturing industry to a service industry. They also projected that there's been increasing demand, there would be an increasing demand for skilled labor, but the supply of workers would diminish of skilled labor. And so because we needed more workers and not as many workers to fill those positions, because they weren't typically being filled by other qualified people, such as women or people of color, that supply started to diminish. And they also projected that the new workforce entrants, people coming into the workforce, would be women and people of immigrants from other countries and racial and ethnic minorities. And we have seen that come true. Okay. They also projected that there'd be an aging of the workforce population. Hello, baby boomers. And they predicted that this is going to be a warning. Businesses needed to start opening up to new populations, and that they would, if they didn't, they would lose out to the competition in terms of attracting and maintaining the best talent. So I'm just adjusting my microphone for just a second. Okay. So in 2014, Google decided to do an analysis of their workforce. Prior to 2014, a lot of the IT firms in Silicon Valley, such as Google, Apple, Yahoo, and Oracle, they had turned down requests from for diversity information from the press and other reporting sources, and one of the reasons was because they just really didn't even know what the impact of the way that their organization was comprised, that there would be an effect on the economy, so to speak, or that there would be so much attention that was put on hiring a diverse workforce, since they didn't necessarily have, I guess you could say, legal ramifications, because people can do what they want if they're not doing business with the government. So Google decided to do this analysis, and then they released this report. And the report showed that the diversity statistics were just awful. Okay, Google's workforce was predominantly white, male, and Asian. Okay, and 74% of their workforce, this is back in 2014, were men in leadership positions. 67% of them were white men. And unfortunately, Google did another analysis in 2018 report, and it showed that things had not changed that much. One of the things that stands out about this is that 3% of Google's workforce is Latino and 2.5% is Black. However, Google has over 46,000 employees, and it has offices in racially diverse cities such as New York, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and Detroit. So there is a pool of applicants there and a pool of qualified candidates, but they just weren't being hired. After Google released their report, then Apple released theirs. They started doing this, and they started working on diversity issues, because back in 2014, although diversity had kind of died down from its heyday back in the 90s when I started in training, there still hadn't been much improvement. So just to summarize just a couple of things, as far as major drivers or major categories of drivers for diversity, companies, organizations typically will adhere to diversity practices either by being pushed or by being pulled. A push element is embodied in legal requirements such as Civil Rights Act or EEOC. And they encourage firms to bring diversity into the workplace through the obligation and sanctions attached to non-compliance. So if you don't comply, you don't do business with us, or you need to put in this affirmative action program, which some organizations still are not all that crazy about. The other element is the pull element. And because of the needs imposed by the war, when Roosevelt first introduced non-discriminatory requirements for government contractors and armed forces, organizations started to decide that they really needed to pull from groups that they typically had not pulled from before, because they needed to increase production, they needed workers, they needed to fill those spots, and they needed to do it because of business survival. And there's expected to be a shortage of skilled workforce, and so that's why a lot of organizations are still trying to tap into a pool of diversified candidates. Some of it is also because of moral obligations, because people are beginning to see that it's the right thing to do. So why all this talk about diversity? What is the impact? Why do we do this? I mean, yeah, we have to do it, but what good does it do? And some of the reasons is that people with diverse backgrounds can offer unique perspectives and insights that will help a company's position in the market. If you have a diverse group of people working on projects, you're more likely to get different solutions than if the same person. Remember, than one person or one type of person. And by type, I mean as far as the group think, as far as one group of people that are thinking the same. Lee Iacocca, you remember, he used to be the CEO of Chrysler. He once said, if I'm in a meeting and I'm asking people for ideas and suggestions, and more than one person gives me the same answer, then I'm hiring too many people. I've got too many people on my payroll. I don't need everybody that's going to think the same and give me the same answer. I want different ideas and solutions. So this helps organizations that have a diverse group of people make more informed decisions. I know that for myself, being an African American woman, is that years ago I would always have a hard time finding hair care products. I remember I lived out in Los Angeles, and I lived in the Valley, which was predominantly white, and so a lot of the grocery stores, they carried products, but not products for my hair. And so once myself, I noticed that once companies started hiring diverse employees, and by diverse employees, I mean people of color, women, people with disabilities, veterans, people with different backgrounds than the mainstream, the line of products that were being carried changed because more informed decisions were being made about who their customers were. Okay. So having a diverse workforce allows you the ability to connect with those that we serve, such as customers, consultants, each other, meaning co-workers, and companies with the highest level of racial diversity. It's been found that they have brought in nearly 15 times more sales revenue than those with the lowest level of diversity. So, okay. So now with that, I'm going to take a pause and just ask if there are any questions out there.
And you're welcome to raise your hand to be unmuted if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. And we're also looking for your questions in the question box as well. I thought it was very interesting going over the historical development of this and the whole idea of the push-pull and the impact today. So very, very interesting. So looking forward to the next section.
Great. Okay. Now let's talk about some of the key concepts. This is one of my favorite parts of the webinar because it talks about the key concepts of diversity and inclusion. Is that we all know, we all think we know, and me included, what diversity is and also what we need to do to make people feel inclusive. But, you know, we all stumble, we all fall. And this is diversity, and learning about diversity is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's something that I know that I'll be learning for the rest of my life. I want to start off just by talking about the Bennett scale. Okay, before we do that, let me ask you all one question, and this is another poll question. Does your organization have systemic efforts related to hiring, performance reviews, supplier diversity, or training that support diversity and inclusion?
So if you could go ahead and take a moment to enter yes or no. Is that supposed to be systematic efforts or systemic?
Systemic. In other words,
okay.
it's ingrained in the system.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. It's ingrained in the system. So it's not just a program or an event, but it's like, you know, we're going to reach out to the community. We're going to try to go to recruiting fairs that will give us a wider range of candidates. We're going to have it embedded in our performance reviews. We're going to make sure we have a mix of suppliers that we buy our products from, or that we're going to offer diversity training. And it's so ironic is that at the site webinar, at the conference, I was talking to different people about the training they offer, and it ranged from full-blown week-long training, you know, that people would take over a year, to no training at all, to 1 hour of training a year. And hopefully we will see that number rise with a lot of the events that are going on currently, because how are people supposed to know if they're not trained?
Right.
Okay.
Last chance to weigh in before I close the poll. Does your organization have systemic efforts relating to hiring, performance reviews, supplier diversity, or training that support diversity and inclusion? Last chance. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, here we go. So we've got 60% say yes and 40% no. Does that surprise you?
Well, no. And I'm glad to see the 60% yes. It doesn't surprise me at all. You know, people do have a variety of efforts that they have in place, but it just depends. I mean, I would love to do a deep down survey to find out specifically what those programs are, because as I mentioned, some of the people I spoke with at the conference, they would get an hour of training every year, where other people, they had it tied to their performance reviews. It was just systemic, meaning that it was throughout the whole system. It wasn't just a one-off type of thing. So, in speaking of that, this leads us to our next slide on the development of intercultural sensitivity. Now, this has to do with organizations and individuals and how we move from ethnocentric stages, meaning thinking about ourselves, to ethno-relative stages, is thinking about others. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly just because we have a lot more to cover, and I want to make sure I cover everything and keep you all to the hour that we promised. So what happens is, and I'll use this as an organization, but this can be for an individual also, is the first stage is denial. This is where people or organizations think that their culture is the only real one, and they're pretty much uninterested in other cultures. Then what will happen is that as you move up the scale, you'll move to defense, and that's defense against difference. This is where people think that their culture is the most evolved culture. It's the best way to live. And examples of this, it's kind of like dualistic thinking, like us versus them. And you'll see examples of this in negative stereotyping, jokes, and things like that, and I'm sure we've all heard these, unfortunately, or just the use of inappropriate words or labels for people. And that's a defense against differences, because people think that their culture is better than others. Then you move to the minimization of differences, so you're slowly beginning to see where similarities outweigh the differences. People will tend to overestimate their tolerance while underestimating the privilege of their own culture. And what this means is that people will still think that they're tolerant of other cultures, but in reality, they just may not understand or realize the power and the privilege that their own culture has. So they think they're tolerant, which they may be, but they're still underestimating the power that they have. So that's when you're minimizing those differences. Okay. Then you move to acceptance of differences, and that's when you accept differences, although they may not be completely agree with everything of that other culture, but you accept them. And you can recognize that a person is accepted by differences by their questioning. They'll ask you questions. They'll ask you questions about your ethnicity, your heritage, your dress, your hairstyle. They'll ask questions. It means they're accepting your difference. Then you move to the adaptation to difference, and that's where you're able to expand your own views and understand other cultures and behave in culturally appropriate ways. And that's where you'll see people that will actually walk in the talk, or organizations. And then the final stage is an integration of difference. And that's when you can move in and out of different cultural views at different times. So you may go to celebrations for cultures that are different than yours. Not just a workplace one, but you actually go out of your way to go to the annual Native American Festival, or you go to the GLBT Film Festival, because you can move in and out of your culture and other cultures also. And so the perception is not of self, it's actually a perception that culture is culture, and not necessarily that yours is the best culture. So diversity, what exactly is diversity? Diversity, typically people think of diversity of, it has to do with women and people of color. And diversity doesn't just have to do with people. There are different types of diversity that have to do with, yes, a diverse workforce is one, but it also has to do with behavior. You all are probably sure all familiar with Myers-Briggs or Insight or DISC, or all the different behavioral personality assessments you can take. So those are different diverse personalities and work styles. Diversity can deal with the structural diversity in an organization, meaning how your departments and divisions are set up. There is business diversity that has to do with suppliers, community outreach, corporate responsibility, all types of diversity. And another misconception, as I mentioned, is that it's just for women or people of color or veterans or people with disabilities. No, diversity includes everyone. An example of this is I was doing some contract work at Dell years ago, and they were building their first diversity website, and they were looking for pictures to put on the website, on the homepage of the website. And so they had all these different pictures of women, people of color. You'd see people, a person that used a wheelchair, um, just these different representation of people, but they had no white men. And white men are just as diverse as a black woman. So diversity is not just about people of color or about women. It includes everybody. Everybody needs to be added to the mix. To be effective, however, diversity has to be integrated into an organization's DNA. That's where the systemic part comes in. It can't just be a program or an event that you have once a year for Cinco de Mayo. That's nice. It's a nice cultural event, but it's not going to change behavior. Diversity does not work without inclusion. Diversity is about your mix of people, while inclusion is about how well your people mix. Okay? So while it's closely related to diversity, it's a separate concept. An inclusive environment is one where all individuals are valued, treated fairly, respected, excuse me, have equal access to opportunities and resources to the organization, and they can contribute fully to the organization's success. It doesn't matter if you have a whole bunch of people in your organization that are different if they are not included, if they don't feel that their contribution is valued. Inclusion takes into account that identities and preferences of individuals may change. They're varied. It's not just the mainstream. And this can be rephrased as saying, treat others the way they want to be treated, not how, the golden rule, treat others the way you treat yourself. No, you treat others the way they want to be treated, because not everybody wants to be treated the way that you want to be treated. Inclusion addresses organizational culture, group interactions, and dynamics, and also individual level attitudes and behaviors. Again, it's not a program, it's not a mindset. However, inclusion does not work without belonging. And you'll start to hear more and more about belonging as more diversity programs are being revamped and revitalized to include inclusion and belonging. So belonging is the sense of fitting in or feeling that you're an important member of the group. Belonging is most effective at onboarding. So when you bring an employee on for the first time, the first couple of weeks or month is crucial for onboarding because of belonging uncertainty. Now, and it doesn't matter who you are, this applies to everybody. Everybody will have this feeling of, am I going to fit in here? Am I going to belong? Am I going to be accepted? But it's especially true for those groups that may have been marginalized in the past. And so remember the quote by Maya Angelou in the beginning, that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they're never going to forget how you made them feel. And so that's why it's important when you're onboarding employees that you make them feel welcome at the beginning. Not just welcome, but valued, that their contribution is important. Okay, another poll question. Does your organization have employee resource groups or committees that organize cultural celebrations?
Let's see if we can get more than half the people to vote. This is good stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh boy. Okay, I'll give you one last chance. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh no. Look at this.
Yeah, that's pretty alarming.
33% yes, 67% no.
And the reason I say that is that back in the 90s, when diversity first started coming into the organization, the first thing they did was, besides some of the larger groups, organizations had training, but the easiest thing to do was, and this is what we thought was right at the time, was to organize these cultural celebrations and committees and these employee resource groups.
Hey, there's
And so that's where you.
one
Uh-huh.
easy way to do it is have a potluck and everyone bring their favorite dish they remember from growing up. That's always fun, right? And that has some
Yeah.
cultural things to it, I would think.
Oh yeah, I belong to this. Well, I shouldn't say it's an organization, but there once a year on MLK Day, or usually around then, there's an organization called Peace Through Pie,
Oh,
and what? Yeah, and they organize this event where these different locations throughout Austin, which is where I am. I'm in Austin, Texas.
hmm.
Will Everybody will bring a pie from their culture, whether it's a sweet pie or a savory pie from their
I love
culture, and
that.
then they'll have like a little diversity workshop, to help people understand differences and also learn about the different pies that have been brought to the group. And it's
Hmm.
called Peace, Peace through Pie, and they do have a website. So
Look at.
yeah, I'm surprised to see that 67% said no, because that was one of the easiest ways. As Sandy said, also as far as the potluck is getting uh, a company to recognize diversity. Not that this is the only thing they need to do, but it's like low hanging fruit. It's low hanging fruit, and it's a first step. So it can't be the only step, but it's a first step. Okay, so unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is also called implicit bias. Bias is basically is a brain's automatic response to taking mental shortcuts based on stereotypes. And it helps you. We do this to help us subconsciously and quickly process information. You know, our brains are getting millions of bits of information per second. However, we're only aware of a few thousand of these. We filter out the rest of them unconsciously so that we can survive in a world, if you think about it, with millions of pieces of information coming towards us at once. Whether we're driving in a car and we have to look at the stoplights, we have to look at our instrument panel, we're listening to the radio, we're talking to people in the car with us. Some of us are texting on the phone, all this information that's going on, and there's no way we can process all this thoroughly, and so we take mental shortcuts. Well, we do this with people also, is we take mental shortcuts about people based on experiences we may have had in the past. This leads to us having a bias against or towards certain people. No one is immune from this. Everybody has them. Even nice people have biases. Biases don't make us bad people, but because biases are different than racism or sexism, because biases can be positive also. Biases could be that I am going to go out of my way to go to this event, or to shop at this store that is from a person of color. The owner is a person of color, or is a person that's a veteran, a person with a disability. That could be a reverse bias or a positive bias. So we all have biases, whether they're good or bad. The problem is we don't know we have them. And so that can be a barrier, because we believe we know our own minds and that we're able to assess people fairly and objectively and accurately, but it's not. It's just an illusion of objectivity. Members of any group can even have biases against their own group, knowing it or not knowing it. And the problem is that biases impact our hiring decisions, our promotion decisions, and retention. And so the challenge is that they're often executed without us knowing that we're doing it. Okay, so on your handout, the Compliance to Science handout, you will see on the right-hand side under the resources, the implicit association test is listed right underneath that, and there's a link that you can go to, and you can take several different tests to help you identify any biases that you may have.
And just a comment, I did take the one that was fed to me when I created a profile. It was veterans to see if there was any bias there. And I thought that was really interesting the way they did that. They have things on religion, gender science, age, Asian, race, Arab, Muslim, sexuality, disability, weapons, gender, career, presidents, weight, skin tone, native. I just thought it was very interesting, very a lot of different tests there.
And because of all the different biases we have, and that we don't even realize that we have it. Okay, so unconscious bias or implicit bias, it's something that we need to be aware of. Another thing we need to be aware of are micro inequities or microaggressions. A micro inequity is a slight that demeans or marginalizes another person. So in these cases, the micro inequity may or may not relate to a person's membership in a protected group. And by protected group, of course, we're talking about those that are protected under EEOC and the Civil Rights Act. But even if it's not, it's still a problem. Okay, so a micro inequity would be something that, and I was in this training once, and the example they gave us had to do with business cards. Like, you know, when somebody gives you a business card, sometimes you may glance at it and then you'll put it away, because I realized I did that after they pointed it out. However, taking someone's business card and reading it right then shows that person that you value, that you've given them this, and that you value, not that necessarily you value them as a person because you're probably just meeting them, but that you're going to take the time to not just discard it and throw it away and not look at it. Okay, that's just one example. Another example is if you're facilitating a meeting or training and you walk around and you put your hands on certain people's shoulders. Of course, now we probably aren't going to do that too much these days in this environment, but you know, just putting your hand on somebody's shoulder, you know, or always calling on the same person in a meeting or in a training class, that's a micro inequity. Or a microaggression could be the opposite, where you don't call on people, where you don't say hello to everybody. If you don't say hello to one person in a group, but you say hello to everybody else. Or somebody walks in on an elevator and you see them time and time again and you don't speak to them, or they don't speak to you. That's a microaggression. Okay, or a group of employees that go out to lunch and they constantly leave one person behind. They're not inviting that person. That's a microaggression. I really like this this graphic because, you know, it's the speak no evil, see no evil, hear no evil, and it just kind of goes to show that we don't necessarily know that these things are going on and that we're doing these things.
It is kind of interesting. I remember there was a discussion one time about those that are introverts versus those that are extroverts, right? So that's a challenge with inclusion too, because introverts don't get their energy from people, right? But you need to tap into them to, you know, gain their insights. And so, you know, there's probably specific things that you could do to kind of make sure that you're not discriminating against your introverts or extroverts, right? Is that a
correct
type of diversity too?
Oh no, yeah, and that's what I had mentioned about the behavioral diversity that in the personalities is introverts and extroverts. Yeah. Definitely, yes, definitely. And a lot of microaggressions are geared towards people that are introverts. You know, they're just ignored sometimes. On your handout, you will also, or actually, we provided the handout of the microaggressions, the examples, and just to kind of give you, and of course I'm not going to go through all this because of time, but some examples of a microaggression are people that say things like, well, you don't sound black, or you're very articulate. You know, I remember they used to say that about Barack Obama, that he's very articulate. He was the president of the United States. He was a Harvard graduate. I would think he would be articulate, but I've never heard them say that Ronald Reagan was articulate, or Bill Clinton, or any of the other white presidents. That, you know, they may say he gets his point across or something like that, which is different than being articulate. Okay, so that's an example of a microaggression. Another example is when people say, oh, he's Christian, but he's very open-minded. So what is that telling you right there is that they're automatically saying that people that are Christian aren't open-minded. So that's a microaggression. But the examples I provided are very good examples, and I hope that you will take the time after this to go through them just so that you're aware of them. I mean, some of them were surprising to me. So it's a very good handout that I hope that you'll use. Okay, I'm going to kind of speed this up because we are running out of time and we have 6 minutes left. The current trend, we talked about this diversity going from compliance to science. The current trend is using people analytics to help hire and retain and promote people. People analytics is where organizations collect personal and business data about their employees so that they can identify who is performing to the level that they should be performing to. In other words, it's not just a manager's own, a manager's biases won't come into effect with this as far as the performance reviews that they're given, but these performance reviews can be based on particular data. So it's moving things towards data and results as opposed to your own personal feelings. So it's moving away from feelings and moving towards data. Okay. So, but the problem with people analytics is using people analytics is that there are a lot of risks involved because with everything being online and everything being tied to metrics, there are a lot of issues with data security, with transparency, with privacy, with permission from employers or candidates even about what data they want to share. These science-based approaches are systemic, meaning that they are when you have an organization that are using people analytics, everything must be set up so that it can capture data, right? So like I said, again, moving away from the feelings-based or the bias-based metrics to help with retention and promotion of employees. And so that can be a problem though, because when you're analyzing this data, it's probably going to be analyzed by a person too, and who knows if they have any biases that can affect the outcome of these, the results of these. So there are a lot of risks involved with people analytics, but pretty much the bottom line is that it's driven by data, not by feelings or best practices. But a lot of organizations are moving towards that to try to level the playing field. Okay, so that means that qualified people will be in qualified positions. Okay, any questions?
All right, go ahead and enter your questions into the question box. If you do have a question or comment and would like to share anything at this time, you could raise your hand to be unmuted. So you've got some choices there. And we'll let you continue and I'll let you know if we have any questions.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, we have just one little section that we want to get through, and that is strategies. What can you do to help build an inclusive environment for your coworkers and also for people outside of the organization? So, because diversity is not just about work. One of the things you can do is be aware of your biases, your inequities, your micro inequities, and your microaggressions, and also remember, you have that implicit association test that will help you identify your biases. You have the examples of microaggressions that will help you realize what may or may not be appropriate to say. Okay. Other things you can do is just watch your first thought. Okay. Stop and listen to what you're thinking or saying when a situation arises or when a choice has to be made. Okay, when you hear something from somebody and you think about it later, think about if you learned, and if you're going to act on what you heard, did you learn it from a reliable source? And how many people do you know actually can confirm that bias that you have? And how many do you know that do not conform to that bias? So you can ask yourself those questions. Also, you can be an advocate by promoting inclusion hiring, retention, and promotions at your organization. Help set team norms for inclusive meetings by ensuring the psychological safety of coworkers, that everyone has a chance to contribute in a meeting or to a team project, that it's not just the same people over and over again. Remember, we have those introverts, like Sandy said, that may be apprehensive about speaking up. And also treat everyone as an individual, which means to act as if your bias does not exist. On that create an action plan, that is on there because on your worksheet, I'm going to talk just a second about a diversity awareness profile that you can take, and you'll see the link for that at the bottom of the handout under the resources. But go ahead, take that profile and see what it's suggesting, things that you can do to help create a more inclusive environment. So make this your little action plan. And even if you don't take the profile, the assessment, then you can just think of things that you can do based on the information in this webinar that can help your coworkers and your neighbors, team members, church members, anybody feel included so that they can contribute fully. So this diversity awareness spectrum, I wish I had more time to go through all this, but I'm out of time. And pretty much what it is a spectrum that kind of shows you where you are on the continuum, whether you're a naive offender, of course that would mean somebody that's doing something because they just don't know, they're clueless, or whether you're a fighter, you're actually somebody that's going out there and fighting for diversity, you're fighting for justice, you're fighting for equality. So I urge you to take that assessment, see what you can do, and encourage others to take it also. It's a free profile. It's a free assessment. So one last thought I want to leave you with. Diversity may be the hardest thing for society to live with, and perhaps the most dangerous thing for society to be without. Just think if you could only eat one type of ice cream, or if you could only have one type of pizza. I'm always using food for these examples. I don't know why, but diversity is the spice of life. Having differences, having choices, just kind of makes things a little bit more exciting. So anyway, I want to thank you guys. I'm going to turn this over to Sandy, but I want to thank you guys for coming to the webinar today. My contact information is here. You all please feel free to contact me at any time if you have any questions, if you're looking for additional resources, and I'll be glad to do what I can to help. And I hope you guys have a good Friday and a good weekend.
Thank you so much, Jill, for a great session. I really do appreciate the time and effort you put together all these great resources. And I know site webinars is just an opportunity for members to learn a little bit and inspire them to learn more. And I could tell you, I am very inspired to go out and do these assessments and really see what I can do to have a positive impact on diversity and inclusion. So thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise today.
Sure, definitely. I just love talking about this subject, and I just love seeing people's eyes light up when they hear something new. But more than that, I love when I see it in action.
That's great. Great. Thank you. And we have some great positive comments. Thank you, Deborah, Cindy, Carla, all of you. I'll be sure to share those with Jill as well. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you in September for our next site webinar. Thanks, all.